All right, now in the aftermath of the Haymarket Square riot, again, the Knights of Labor, they fall out of favor. People are terrified that any union member might be an anarchist or a socialist or might be trying to overthrow the government, and so the Knights of Labor end up falling apart. Now, in response to this, or I guess kind of as a byproduct of this, in 1886 we see the rise of the American Federation of Labor. And this one is really unlike previous unions because the AFL is going to focus more on practical economic goals, so things like increasing wages, increasing better working conditions. And it's founded in 1886 by skilled workers in craft unions. And so the guy who's going to really become recognized as being a major leader of this is a guy named Sam Gompers. He is a cigar maker out of Tampa, but he's going to end up directing a lot of these local unions to walk out until the companies agree to collective bargaining. So again, the focus here is on collective bargaining. Now, it's going to be the most successful of these labor unions. By 1901, they have over 1 million members, and this is a union that is still in effect today. Now, in the 1890s, though, despite their attempt to try to avoid strikes, if at all possible, they do get sucked into some strikes. And so one of these strikes is going to be the Homestead Strike, which takes place in 1892 at Carnegie Steel. And in this, Henry Frick, who is the manager of Carnegie Steel, so he basically runs the company for Andrew Carnegie, he is told to cut wages and cut costs by 20%. So Carnegie tells him to do this, and he tells him not to negotiate with the union. Now, Frick then, under Carnegie's directive, is going to use harsh tactics to try to break that union. So he uses things like the lockout, where they just lock the workers out. They hire Pinkerton guards to come in. They hire scabs, largely immigrants and African Americans, to come in and replace the native-born white workers who are going on strike. And this goes on for 5 months before the union is finally defeated by the walkout. Now, again, William Henry Harrison, continuing these policies started by Hayes back in 1877, is going to use federal troops to break the strike. So, again, this ends up becoming a huge failure for the AFL, and they see a huge setback until we get to the New Deal in the 1930s. The other union you guys need to know about is the American Railroad Workers Union, and they end up rising here in the 1880s after the failure of the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor in organizing railroad workers after that great railroad strike in 1877. Now, they are going to be led by a guy named Eugene Debs, and Debs, he ends up eventually becoming disgruntled, especially the aftermath of the Pullman strike, and eventually ends up becoming a socialist. And so for this reason, a lot of members of the American Railroad Workers Union are depicted as being socialist, even though most of them are not. And the Pullman strike is the major strike associated with the Railroad Workers Union, and it takes place in 1884 at the Pullman sleeper car factory. Now, Pullman sleeper cars were the fanciest possible railroad cars you could ride on. It's kind of like riding in a 5-star hotel while you're going down the rails. And the Pullman sleeper car factory, Pullman also was he kind of believed that he could create a workers' utopia. And so he actually owned his own factory town. It was called Pullman. And in it, he provided all the workers' housing. He provided the company's store. He provided parks. He provided free public education. He provided all kinds of recreation activities. He provided libraries. In any case, the idea was that this would make the workers happy, so then he could avoid any involvement of the union. Well, this changes in 1894 because in response to the panic of 1893, he ends up having to cut wages. And so he cuts wages for his workers, but at the same time, he doesn't cut rent in the company town. And so for this reason, workers are forced to work longer hours in order to pay the same rent in the houses that they're living in. And so they get upset by this, and they eventually end up joining the American Railroad Workers Union and going on strike. Now, Debs directed his union members just not to handle any trains so that involved Pullman cars. So they're learning from the railroad strike of 1877 in that they're not just boycotting work on all trains in all railroad industries, which involves interstate trade and thus the federal government. But instead, they're going to just focus on trains involving Pullman cars. So it's more of a strike against Pullman and less of a strike against interstate trade, which would make it a federal offense. And so he's trying to keep federal troops out of this. Ultimately, this boycott ties up traffic nationwide, and eventually you start to see these railroad companies getting smart and starting to attach mail trains onto these trains involving Pullman cars. And so for this reason now, this causes strikers to violate federal law, they disrupt the delivery of mail, and in response to this, President Cleveland ends up sending in federal troops and he issues an injunction to break the strike. Now, this ended up frustrating a lot of union workers since Cleveland was a Democrat and they really hoped that he would side with workers over labor, but this doesn't end up happening. And so Debs ends up ignoring the injunction. He ends up being arrested and spending time in jail, and he actually ends up running for president from his jail cell during the 1896 election. And so we end up in the Supreme Court over this, where in the Supreme Court case, this is called In re Debs versus U.S. The court basically approves the use of injunctions to end strikes. This becomes kind of the favored tactic of all presidents throughout the Gilded Age all the way through the 1930s. And again, this is what causes Debs to turn to socialism. And so by 1900, only 3% of all wage workers are union members. This decreases unionization, but not the complaints by these union members.